It has undermined the ability for senators to perform our constitutional duty to advise and consent on the nominee because of the withholding of critical information that I believe is absolutely necessary to evaluate someone. This constitutional duty means that we should have a process that allows transparency into that person's record. The public has a right to know who the individual is that we're voting on tomorrow, what their record is. The public has a right to know. Why would we hide their record from public scrutiny? So step one of the sham was a Republican majority's refusal to request any records from Judge Kavanaugh's time as staff secretary to President George Bush. 0 records, none requested whatsoever. Now, Brett Kavanaugh himself held that position for 3 years, and he called those 3 years of his career, and I quote, the most interesting and most formative years of his career. The most interesting and most formative in shaping his approach to serving as a judge, and in which he presumably advised the president on everything from national security policy to a proposed constitutional ban on same-sex marriages. So many critical issues that are germane to his job and his experience and the formation of his ideals was happening during those times, but we said we could see nothing from his record. Even things that are not classified, not national security, things that would give us a better window in to who he is. Step 2 of the sham was to create a wholly unaccountable process for the fraction of the White House records that the Republican majority did request from Kavanaugh's time in the White House counsel's office. This process was essentially made up, had no reflection in the history of this body, no reflection at all. And so what happened was they put into place a practice where a private lawyer, Bill Burke, who happens to be a longtime political operative, who was a former deputy to Brett Kavanaugh himself, when he was staff secretary, was put in part of the process as a chokehold on documents getting to senators for our evaluation. Most of the documents of this candidate's work product have not been seen by any senator here. In fact, about 90% of his relevant work experience, his relevant work products, has not been reviewed by any senator here. Imagine hiring somebody where you only see 90% of their resume, where you only see 10% of their resume, because 90% is obscure. You wouldn't hire, most of the folks here wouldn't hire an intern in their office if somebody was hiding 90% of their resume. But then there's step 3 of the sham. In conjunction with Mr. Burke, the committee chairman designated 186,000 pages, something that was new, called committee confidential, in order to hide them from the public because they might harm the nomination. Imagine this. The public having a right to know, the public needing transparency, and now they're hiding yet again under the name committee confidential critical documents. And they withheld 102,000 pages from the committee altogether, threatening to invoke some nebulous constitutional privilege. And as a result, today, just hours before the final vote, only 7% of Kavanaugh's record from the Bush White House has been released to senators. We are making a decision only knowing 7% of their work product. When women's rights, when workers' rights, when LGBT rights, when voting rights, when affordable health care is all in the balance, we know so little about this candidate. And because of all that's at stake, several of my colleagues and I made the decision to release those documents, but it was still just a fraction. Meanwhile, Judge Kavanaugh's initial testimony before the Judiciary Committee raised my concern because he continued to evade questions, refused to answer our questions. But then after Dr. Blasey Ford came forward, he gave his testimony, and I was stunned. You see, at Judge Kavanaugh's initial hearing in early September, he testified that he wanted to stay, and I quote, 3 zip codes away from politics. He insisted that the Supreme Court must never, I emphasize that word, never be viewed as a partisan institution. But when he came before the Judiciary Committee again last week, Judge Kavanaugh jettisoned his own advice, his own belief in judicial temperament, his own belief in how a judge should behave and be nonpartisan, and he leveled blatantly political accusations. He said the allegations against him were nothing more than, quote, an orchestrated political hit, even speculating that they were motivated by, a, quote, the revenge on behalf of the Clintons. He cast blame on outside left-wing opposition groups. He told the Democrats that our questioning of him at the hearings had been, quote, an embarrassment. He was belligerent. He was evasive. At times, he was outright deceptive, and at times, he was deeply disrespectful to my Senate colleagues. He displayed the type of fierce partisanship that no American should ever want to see in a federal judge. He went on to say, I quote, almost as if a menacing threat, he said, what goes around comes around. What goes around comes around. Is this someone who could sit on the highest court on the land where political issues might come before him, that has not already revealed himself to be deeply partisan, that has not already revealed himself to have a deep-seated anger towards people of certain political stripe? Is this someone who shows the kind of judicial temperament, not for a district court, not for a circuit court, but for the highest court in the land, the court of last resort? He said all of this in response to questions. He didn't say all this in response to questions. This wasn't off-the-cuff comments. This was part of his prepared testimony. Those quotes were in his prepared testimony. In another instance during his testimony, he warned that, quote, this is a circus, he said. The consequences will extend long past my nomination. The consequences will be with us for decades. Well, that's how I want to end. What are the consequences for the way this has run, for a sham process, for a sham FBI investigation? What are the consequences in relation to women who came forward before the world's most deliberative body with credible accusations of sexual misconduct, of sexual assault, of sexual violence? What are the consequences to a body that runs a partisan process, that ignores the truth, that shields relevant aspects of his record 90% from the public? What are the consequences as they rush to the Senate floor hoping nobody knows the truth and ignoring investigating some of the most serious charges that could be leveled against someone, charges of violence, charges of assault? What are the consequences for us in this body behaving in this way? What are the consequences for Dr. Christine Blasey Ford, who has forever altered her life, for her civic duty, for her patriotism, for her love of country? She sacrificed to come forward, and how do we treat her? This has been an emotional week for so many, and I have seen and heard and witnessed the pain, the trauma that has been dredged up. I've heard from some of my colleagues in private meetings and telling about dozens of people coming forward to them having never told people about their sexual assault, and now they come and tell their senator, hoping that their story, that their pain, that they haven't even shared with their spouse, will somehow make a difference in the larger story of our country, will somehow make a difference at this moment when two women were not being listened to, were not letting their stories get the worthy recognition, the worthy investigation. I've heard my colleague after colleague tell me the stories, the painful stories, and I've heard them myself. Friends of mine who I never knew never knew they were assaulted. I never knew their pain, never knew of their trauma. But at this moment in American history, they felt like they had to come forward. They had to tell their truth. Like Christine Blasey Ford, like Ms. Ramirez, they felt now was the time to speak up and stop this nation from making a mistake and try to stop the injustice and try to end a national nightmare where 1 out of 3 women are assaulted, and most of them don't feel comfortable coming forward. They don't feel safe coming forward. They feel like if they come forward, they'll be maligned, they'll be hated, they'll be disrespected, they'll be disregarded. Their charges will be swept under the rug. Their charges will be ignored. But yet a chorus of women and men all across this country have been telling their stories, screaming into this nation, hoping the national conversation will shift in this country from abusing those who have been abused to elevating truth again. This body has had a test, and we are failing that test. This body has had a chance. This body has had a responsibility, and we have surrendered that responsibility. And so tomorrow we vote. And it seems like the die is cast. I heard there were celebrations and cheering in the White House. And in the last few hours, I've also heard the pain and the anguish and the hurt. And I've heard the tears. It seems so unjust. It seems so unfair that 2 courageous women came forward to this body and we couldn't even investigate their claims. We couldn't even take time to talk to witnesses. And so a lot of folk now are asking me, what now? I want to conclude by reading some words from another painful period, where people didn't know what this body would do. There was injustice in this land, and people didn't know what this body would do. Hundreds, thousands, hundreds of thousands came forward to march and to protest and to sit in, and they didn't know what this body would do. But they stood anyway, and they fought anyway. Sometimes they were beaten. In fact, in one case on a bridge in Alabama, they were beaten and bloodied. One of my colleagues in the other chamber, John Lewis, had his head split open, but they eventually got over that bridge and got to Montgomery, and a man named King gave this speech to those people who were tempted to surrender to cynicism in that time. He gave this speech to those people who wanted to give up. He gave that speech to those people who were hurting. This is what he said. And I quote, he goes, "I know you're asking today, how long will it take? Somebody's asking, how long will prejudice blind the visions of men, darken their understanding, and drive bright-eyed wisdom from her sacred throne? Somebody's asking, when will wounded justice lying prostrate on the streets be lifted from the dust of shame to reign supreme among the children of men?" Somebody is asking. When will the radiant star of hope be plunged against the nocturnal bosom of this lonely night, plucked from the weary souls with chains of fears and the manacles of death? How long will justice be crucified and truth bear it? I come to say to you this afternoon, however difficult the moment, however frustrating the hour, it will not be long, because truth crushed to the earth will rise again. How long? Not long, because no lie can live forever. How long? Not long, because you shall reap what you sow. How long? Not long. How long? Not long, because the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And so I say to every American that is hurting tonight, every American that's angry tonight, tomorrow we face a defeat but we shall not be defeated. Tomorrow, it may seem like a loss, but all hope is not lost. I have faith in us as a country. I know it has been a long journey. I know we have suffered much, but I have a faith in this country that is abiding and cannot be destroyed, because we are a nation that always finds a way to move forward, to learn, to grow. And what is dependent upon us doing that is for us to never, ever give up. Never give up. The days ahead will be difficult. It will not be easy. But I have faith in America. We will learn, we will grow, we will get better, we will come together if we never give up. Tomorrow the vote may be what it is, the die may be cast, but I will never give up on this country. I will never give up on women. I will never give up on the ideals and principle that we all swear an oath to, that this nation truly will be one day a nation of liberty and justice for all. Thank you, Mr. President.